Now, those who have their Bible, if you could turn to the book of Numbers and chapter 13, and we're jumping over quite a bit of the Bible, but many of the chapters following last Wednesday are dealing with priestly garments, how to make the garments, what they're to look like, rules of sacrifice, many different rules and regulations, the rebuilding the temple and the temple vessels and so on. And I prefer just to kind of hit the highlights regarding the Israelites and their deliverance from Egypt and into the land of promise. And in Numbers 13, we see them coming to the edge of the promised land and then making a very big mistake. And time-wise, probably about a year has passed by since they left Egypt, and not that long really, and now they're on the edge of the land of promise, and they make a bad decision. And if we were to maybe characterize tonight's lesson, it would be how not to make a decision. They're faced with a big decision, and they make a very bad decision. And we'll see various mistakes along the way they make in their decision. And we always have to make decisions. Little ones, big ones, in between ones. Everyone here, we have decisions. And so the Bible does say these things are written for our example. And so the big example tonight, or in this passage, would be how to make a good decision by seeing what happens when we make a bad decision and how a bad decision comes about. Anyway, looking at the book of Numbers and verse 13, remember they're on the edge of the land of promise, and God speaks to them in Numbers chapter 13, verse 1. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Send thou men, that they may search the land of Canaan, which I give unto the children of Israel. Of every tribe of their fathers shall he send a man, every one a ruler among them. And Moses, by the commandment of the Lord, sent them from the wilderness of Paran. All those men were heads of the children of Israel. And the next verses give a list of the names, and one man from each tribe, and they're to be sent out to actually search the land. Now, when we look at this chapter, we see the Lord telling them to do this, to choose men and to send them to search out the land. But there's a bit more that meets the eye as to whose decision to send these men. And so if you can turn or either just listen to another passage in the next book, in the book of Deuteronomy, and chapter 1. And we have a bit of a background to the men going out to search the land. You all know the story. The men go out to spy out the land. And in Deuteronomy chapter 1, we see whose idea it was. First of all, who thought of the idea to send men out to search the land. So Deuteronomy chapter 1, and in this chapter, Moses recounts kind of a history of the Israelites' experience from Egypt into the land of promise. And in verse 22, we come to the part we are at now, the edge of the land. Verse 22, and Moses says, And you came near unto me, every one of you, and said, We will send men before us, and they shall search us out the land, and bring us word again, by what way we must go up, and into what cities we shall come. And the saying pleased me, Moses said, Well, and it took 12 men of you, one of a tribe. And then he goes on talking about them going up to search the land. And so if we weren't looking at Deuteronomy, we'd say, well, it sounds like God is in this all the way through. God is sending men out to search the land. But here Moses in Deuteronomy 1 tells us that the idea originally came from the Israelites. They said, we think we should send people out ahead of us and check out the land. But it was basically the idea of the Israelites, and Moses goes along with it. In verse 23, Moses said, "And the saying pleased me well. And it took 12 men of you one of a tribe." And so the people agitate to have some men sent out to spy out the land. And Moses says that's a good idea. And now in Numbers 13, God actually says in in chapter 13, in the beginning, God says, "Send the men out." Now, in the Bible, we have at least one big example of people agitating for something that's not God's will, and finally God going along with it. Remember when the Israelites wanted a king? They went to Samuel and said, "Samuel, we want to be like the other nations. They have their king, and we don't have a king. We want a king." And the prophet Samuel warned them. He said, "Now, you shouldn't be asking for a king. Someday you'll be sorry, because the king will take your young men and young women and turn them into servants, and he'll eventually lay taxes on the land. You'll be unhappy about it." But they said, "Samuel, we insist, we want a king." And finally, God said to Samuel, "Samuel, just give in to the people, let them have their king." And there's a comment in the book of Psalms regarding this, and the verse says, God gave them their request. They want a king. God gave them their request, but sent leanness under their soul. And so it is possible for a Christian to insist on some particular course of action and insist, and it's not really God's will for them, but God kind of allows plan B to go through. And he may allow it to teach us a lesson. And when the men are sent out to search out the land, it's basically God's plan B. God didn't begin the idea of sending men out, but the Israelites did. Moses went along with it. And Moses was a great man, but he wasn't a perfect man. And someone pointed out that just before this, Moses had gone through some kind of bad trouble with the Israelites. That was typical. And he's maybe not feeling quite as leaderly or leader-like as normal. And so he just kind of goes along with it. And so I guess the first lesson in making a bad mistake is initiate the idea ourselves without checking with God. Maybe we're buying a house or buying a car or some big decision, moving somewhere, whatever, big decision, and we think it through and we decide what we want and go ahead with it, but we don't check it out with God first. And so even though God is now allowing it as plan B, we'll see how this decision becomes almost a disaster for the nation Israel. Anyway, back to Numbers, and we'll see what happens next. In verses 4 through 15, the names are chosen, and actually, apparently Moses, I think, chose them and lists them. And then verse 17, "And Moses sent them to spy out the land of Canaan, and said unto them, Get you up this way southward, and go up into the mountain, and see the land, what it is, and the people that dwelleth therein, whether they be strong or weak, few or many, and what the land is that they dwell in, whether it be good or bad." Now already there are some little problems coming up. Before this happened, before Moses said, check out to see whether the land is nice or not, God had already told them. God said, "I'm giving you a land that's flowing with milk and honey." So God has already told Moses it's a good land. But Moses said, well, let's check it out. Let's see if it really is good. And also, when Moses says, let's check it out whether it be strong or weak, he's kind of leaving kind of a little opening there. If it's strong, what will we do? Will we really attack them? Will we occupy? If it's strong, then he goes on. Rest of verse 19. And what cities there be that they dwell in, whether in tents or in strongholds. And what the land is, more about the land. Whether it be fat or lean, well, God said it was a good land. Whether there be wood therein or not. And be ye of good courage, and bring of the fruit of the land. And then going down to verse 22, and they ascended by the south, and came unto Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the children of Anak, were. Now Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. And they came unto the brook of Eshcol, and cut down from thence a branch with one cluster of grapes. And they bare it between two upon a staff, and they brought of the pomegranates and of the figs. And the place was called the brook of Eshcol, because of the cluster of grapes, which the children of Israel cut down from thence. And they returned from searching the land after 40 days. And now they're going to come back with a report. And we'll see two reports. One for occupying the land. Remember, God's already commanded them to take the land. But there will be two reports, one against occupying and one for occupying. And let's go to verse 27. They're talking to Moses and the people. And they told him and said, we came unto the land whither thou sentest us, and surely it floweth the milk and honey, and this is the fruit of it. They brought back some grapes and so on. Nevertheless, a big if, nevertheless, the people be strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled and very great. And moreover, we saw the children of Anak there. And this group of people were known for their big size. And later on, as they go through, they talk about giants in the land. So now they're being negative. They say it's a nice land, but there are problems. The cities are strong, they have big walls, and the children of Anak, the big people, are there. And then verse 29, the Amalekites, another warrior tribe, dwelt in the land of the south, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites dwell in the mountains, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea and by the coast of Jordan. Lots of people there, lots of warring people there. And so the negative report is, it's a nice land, but. In verse 30, Caleb has the minority report, and Caleb stilled the people before Moses and said, let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it. But the men that went up with him said, we be not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. And they brought up an evil report of the land, which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, the land through which ye have gone to search it is a land that eateth up the inhabitants thereof. And all the people that we saw in it are men of great stature. They're very big. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers. And so we were in their sight. A bit exaggerated, we're so tiny compared to them. We're like grasshoppers. And so the men have been sent out, and there are 10 of them, there are 12 went out. 10 of them bring back a bad report. Nice land, fruits there, nice land, but too strong for us. There are giants there. There are big people there, and they're stronger than we are. Now, certainly there are differences in different countries as to height. I've actually seen lists in the European countries, who's the tallest and who's the shortest, and the tallest men in Europe are the Dutch people. They're nice, big, and tall. And I forget who the shortest are, not a whole lot, but I think maybe an inch or two on average. And there certainly are variations. And certainly here we have an indication that there were some people there that were big people. But when they talk about giants, it doesn't mean they were like 12 or 15 feet tall. It doesn't mean that. And what example do we have of a giant named in the Bible? Goliath is named, isn't he? And I think Goliath was about 8 feet tall, wasn't he? Something like that, about 8 feet? Maybe so you remember exactly. And just out of interest, I went to the internet, we all go to the internet, to find out who the biggest man ever was. And they had a report in, I think, Wikipedia, saying that the tallest man, at least in fairly modern times, that was, his height was actually measured and proven, was a man in the States. I think he lived in the 1940s. His first name was Robert, and said they measured him at 8 feet 11 inches. That's really big. And just for fun, I stood against that door to see how far I'd reach up. I think I would reach up to that horizontal line up near on the top. And I think that door might be maybe 7 feet. But this man was almost 9 feet. And if you look at that door, he was probably at least a foot taller than the top of that door. He was big. And if he were content, he had to bend over pretty low just to get through that door. And there was actually a picture of him with his family. And his family basically didn't come much above his waist. He was big all over, just in proportion, just really big. And then it went on to say that I think they had a list of living men today who were in the 8-foot range. And there were a handful. There was a farmer in Turkey who was 8 foot something. And there may have been about a dozen men were 8 plus. And I think one lady was about 7 feet plus. And certainly there's some basketball players who are very big. And I've seen big football players. Edmonton there was, when they were called Eskimos, there was a fellow, he was about 6'8". He was big. And there are big people. And apparently this family of Anak, they were big people. And some even say maybe Goliath was, later on, he came later on, but maybe he was a descendant of them. But when they say giants, they're not like 12 feet or 15 feet or like that, but there are big people, no doubt. But notice they were exaggerating, just like grasshoppers. They're so big. And one thing you might notice in the majority report, God is not mentioned. God isn't mentioned. And so when we're making a decision, if we're not bringing God into it, it's not going to be a very good decision. So not only did they initiate the idea of checking out the land, and they didn't need to check out the land because God told them he was giving them the land. So basically God had promised them, you can have the land. I'll go with you, I'll give it to you. So God had promised that they could have the land. And so for them to check out the land to see if they're weak or strong was showing doubt. I think we better check, yes, God said to give us the land, but we better check it out. Maybe they're bigger than we thought they were. And God isn't mentioned. And so when we make a decision, be careful, be sure God is number one in the decision. And number two, be very, very careful that you don't show doubt and unbelief. And they were showing doubt and unbelief. A long time ago, when they were in Egypt, God said, I'm giving you land. And so that was a promise. Now, maybe God will give it to us, maybe not. And so they're showing doubt. Now, I know a man some years ago was very definitely called to preach. And so he made plans to go to preach. He resigned his job, kind of burned his bridges, and he prepared to go on his way to preach. He was talking to an acquaintance about it, saying, I've resigned my job. I'm believe God's calling me to preach. I've resigned my job. I'm going to preach. The other man said, brother, be a bit careful about that. What you should do, instead of resigning your job, take a 1-year sabbatical. Try it for a year. Try preaching for a year. If it goes, fine. If it doesn't work, you'll still have your job. Now, this man didn't do that. He said, now, if I do that, I'd be showing doubt. I'm called to preach. God's not going to call me to fail. He's calling me. The same God that called me is going to take care of me. If I hang on to my job, say, just in case it doesn't work, I'll be back, I'm showing doubt. And that was true. And so when we're very sure of a decision, we need to be careful we don't do things, even maybe not even noticing, that is showing doubt in it. And when we're sure God wants us to do something, we should be all in. Not just a case, we're going to check it out, I'll give it a try, I'll have my plan B. I think God called me to be a missionary, but just in case it doesn't work, I'm going to have a plan B, something I can fall back on. And that's not really the way God wants us to make a decision. Anyway, they come back with the bad report, and bad consequences follow. I know you folks kind of know what happened. We'll get into that next day. But God, of course, is displeased with them. And because they refuse to go into the land, God punishes them, judges them. And God says, because you wouldn't enter in, you can't go in now. You're going to spend about 40 years wandering in the wilderness till all the young men die, except for 2, Caleb and Joshua. They were both for the good report. They were kept alive. The rest all died in the wilderness. And so the bad decision cost them dearly. They had meant 40 more years in the wilderness. They didn't even see the land, the younger ones. But I guess if a person were to make a big study how not to make a decision, before you even start planning, ask God about it. What does God want me to do? And then when you make the decision, be sure God is in it. Number 3, no matter how hard the circumstances might be, God is bigger than the circumstance. Now, as far as Caleb and Joshua who gave the good report were concerned, it wasn't a case of who's stronger, we or the Canaanites. It was a case of who's stronger, the Canaanites or God. And when God has called us to do something and we're sure about it, we're not to be looking and worried about the strength of the circumstances. We're to look to God who can do anything. And then we'll go on next day to see some of the consequences of the bad decision. Lord, we do thank you for these examples. And Lord, help us to learn how not to make a bad decision. To even keep in mind that if we insist on a wrong course, God may even allow us to take plan B to teach us a lesson. And so, Lord, when we're planning on a decision, help us to put God number 1. And then, Lord, help us to, when we look at the circumstances, to consider not, am I strong enough for the circumstances? Is God strong enough for the circumstances? And we know he always is. Now, Lord, just bless each one tonight, bless your fellowship, and just bless us together. We ask in the name of the Lord Jesus, amen.